Good morning from the Dolomites. I'm here in winter. We're leading a winter workshop now, and I don't normally film videos when I'm leading workshops. I thought it might be fun this year to give it a try, see how it works. So what I'm going to try and do while I'm here over the next week is to film what we're doing, film some of the workshop, film some of the locations that we're shooting, talk a lot about photography, talk about the shots that we're doing, and try and do it with an iPhone, just with an iPhone, and see how that turns out. Because when I'm out in the field, I really do like to be focused purely on photography and on the mood and the feel of the place. It informs a lot of my images and the way that I shoot. And I do find it very hard to kind of divide my head between producing videos and focusing on still photography. And this is doubly true on workshops when I really like to be focused on the group and on getting the most out of a scene with the group. But I found with the iPhone that I've been shooting more and more short video clips, and the quality is so good. I've been really impressed by the kind of quality that it can produce. So I really felt that on this trip that if I could shoot videos quickly and discreetly enough that it would allow me to still maintain my focus on still photography, then that might be an interesting way of actually recording this trip and talking about the photos that we're shooting here. So we made it up in the Snowmobile to Telephoto. Here we are. As you can see, it's pretty much a whiteout here. We can't see a lot, but we're going to stay around and see if we can get a shot of the peaks framed by the clouds, because it's really quite peaceful and quite atmospheric, and it's nice to create something unusual. So we're going to have a look at that before we go back down, before it gets too dark. Because the walk over to where we are now is quite tricky. It's deep snow, it's slippy, and we don't want to be going down too much in the dark and making that risky. And then to get back down to the car, we're going to go back down on sleds, which is going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be an adventure, I hope. Yeah. Now, as it turned out, the clouds are so thick we literally couldn't get a shot of the Telephoto peaks while we were there. And this is the reality of landscape photography. Quite often you make an effort to get to a location and you don't get a single shot. But as we were walking back to the sledges, I caught a glimpse of one of the distant peaks, and it was being sort of revealed and concealed by these clouds swirling around the top of it. Now, it's certainly not a great shot, but it is an image, and it was certainly worth getting the camera out to shoot it, because for me, it's always better to come back with something than with nothing at all. Now, in places like this where the clouds are moving really fast, I had to shoot the scene really quickly, and I didn't get the time to set up the tripod, because by the time I'd set up the tripod, the clouds would have probably swirled around it and the image would have been gone. So I chose to capture it handheld, which meant boosting the ISO higher than I normally would because the light levels were quite low. Now, when it comes to technique for hand holding, the general rule is that double the focal length for the shutter time. So here we're shooting at 70 millimeters, so I should have been looking at a shutter time of around 1140, 1150, but I had the iOS, the image stabilizer, the lens stabilization turned on, which generally gives me about 2 stops, so that takes me back down to around 1/30th, which pretty much put this within an acceptable level of handheld shooting. Now, it would have been better with a tripod, it would have given me a better shot, but I might have missed it in those few moments if I'd taken the time to stop and set the tripod up. Now, as I said, it's not a great image, it's not a portfolio shot, but sometimes you just get what you can. Now, fortunately, we had much better luck with the conditions at the other locations where we shot. So here at Paso Joao, this is a fantastic place to shoot both in the summer and the winter. At sunrise, which is when we were shooting here, and also at sunset. You've got views in just about every direction and lots of possibilities with a wide angle lens, with a telephoto lens. But here this was shot with a drone, and just having a drone gives you another perspective entirely. With drone photography, you have quite a lot of freedom to move the camera around up and down, left and right. So I put the drone in such a place that it really emphasized the line of the curve on the hill on which we were standing, giving me these converging lines, and then got the drone low enough so that the brow of the hill we were standing on was actually below the line of the peaks behind us, which put the group directly in front of the rising sun. Now, strong light is always a powerful compositional tool because it's naturally going to pull the eye towards it. And here I used the backlighting of the figures to create the main focal point, with the line of the hill working as an element, pulling the line in, and being framed between these two peaks on the left and right. Now, from an exposure point of view, when you're shooting directly into light like this, the dynamic range is always going to be extremely wide. So I actually bracketed 5 shots. It's something I tend to do with the drone, as the dynamic range on the sensor isn't as wide as the dynamic range on my camera, on my X-T3. But I very rarely need all 5 shots, and here I just basically needed 2 to blend together. But at the end of the day, this was it's probably one of my favorite images from the trip, certainly my favorite image from the morning, because it's always nice to get something original from a location. So this is an image taken on the same morning, but with a much more conventional wide angle composition. Now, the peak makes an obvious focal point, and with this hill in front of us, there was a natural leading line towards it, supported by the other various lines in the compositions of the hills. But I felt the composition felt a little bit flat. It was really lacking in any depth, and that's why shooting with a really wide angle lens, when you can find a strong foreground element, can really work. But finding foregrounds isn't always that easy, particularly in snow. There are a lot of footprints around the scene, but having a look around, I found on the southern side of this hill of these kind of shapes. Now, it wasn't perfect. I would have liked some nice clean lines, but I really liked the way that the curve of the slope here supported the line that led towards my main focal point, which is also really nicely positioned between the peak of Marmalade on the left and the cellar towers on the right. Now, the fact that it's closer and the lack of haze around this peak, giving it more brightness, also helps to separate it from those 2 peaks behind it and really pull the eye towards it. I shot this at f7.1, which, with the particular wide angle zoom lens that I'm using, it tends to perform really well there. In terms of focus, I'm shooting with an APS-C sensor, with a crop sensor, and you get a huge amount of depth field at this aperture. It starts at something like 40-something centimeters in front of the camera and then goes on to infinity. Now, 40 centimeters is really close. It's rare that I'll have the tripod below that. So unless there's something projecting from the ground to the lens, like a flower or something like that, I find I very rarely need to focus stack. Now, with a full frame sensor, and again with a medium format, this is different. You've got less depth of field, and you probably would need to focus stack on a composition like this. Certainly with the GFX, I'd need to focus stack here. But for this particular image, I didn't. I could do the whole thing. I could get the focus front to back in one shot. I'm always going to be troubled by this patch of bare mountain here where the snow hadn't settled and slid off the side of the mountain. But I think I've said in videos before that failure is an essential part of landscape photography. Every session doesn't end with an image that's going to stay in our portfolio. But putting that aside, there's actually just a pleasure in the simple art of composition, of looking at the elements, of taking in what you see around you and just creating some image, even though that image may be less than perfect. So this is an attempt to capture the same scene in a different way to the wide angle image that you've just seen. It's telephoto panorama with a selection of images shot in portrait format arranged into a panorama. Now, it's actually taken on a different morning when we had a little bit more interest in the sky. Now here I really ignored the foreground and aimed just to capture the vista across the horizon, the view of the peaks. And our panos, they work just like any composition. Just panning across the scene doesn't work. There needs to be a focal point, and there need to be other elements in the image to support that. And I felt that this same peak worked well as a focal point as in the previous image. And you've got these different lines and triangles within the scene working to support it and to pull the eye through the image towards the peak. Then you've got these repeated shapes, things like this, which always give strength to a composition. Now, in terms of shooting this, it's important with panos to shoot with all the exposure settings in manual, because otherwise, as you move through the image, the scene, you're going to find that the auto exposure is going to change the exposure settings, and you'll get a different exposure on the different frames, which means, for example, the sky is going to be darker or brighter in one frame than another, and it's going to be very obvious when you blend it together. Now, you can't really adjust that later. Exposure in camera and exposure in software never really work in the same way. The balance of tones between shadows and midtones and highlights is never the same. So it's just better to set a manual exposure that will work to capture the whole scene. If you can't do it with one exposure, then you can bracket it and then sweep across with the camera with the exposure set in manual. Now, for me personally, I always think it's a good idea to have the white balance set manually as well, because as you move through the scene, the values might change, giving you a slightly cooler or warmer frames. Now, again, you can adjust this in post, but I shoot a lot of video, and adjusting white balance mid-clip in a video, getting it to match really is complex. So I've just basically got this ingrained habit of always shooting with my white balance set to daylight. That way I know it's always going to be consistent across each frame that I shoot. And the final thing with panoramas is to ensure that when you're shooting them, you've got a significant overlap between each frame. Now, I always recommend something between 30% and 50%, because that way you'll ensure that Lightroom's got lots of overlap and can stitch the frames together successfully. And the leveling base, if you can get one, is also really handy to make sure that you keep the scene level as you pan the camera through each frame. Now, one of the most successful shoots that we had came early in the workshop at Passo Falzargo, which is a high pass overlooked by the peaks of Lagazoy and Tofana, which really catch the first light when the sun comes up and paints them in the morning. Now, in this location, I really wanted to shoot wide to include these two leaning trees, which work as an arrow pulling your eye towards Tofana, the peak of Tofana. But on their own, they really weren't enough. I felt that the image lacked depth. It needed some foreground element to give some balance to the two elements here. Three elements is always a strong compositional structure. It creates a triangle that the eye can move around. It makes the image feel much more dynamic as the eye moves through that triangle. And this meant shooting ultra wide angle, which does diminish the peaks. It's always going to make the peaks smaller. But I felt that it was worth it for the strength of these leading lines and how it balances with the other elements in the image. Without these leading lines, the image just felt a lot weaker and had a lot less depth. So I found these lines, which were caused by winds and the snow, and then got really low to emphasizing them. When it comes to processing this image, there was already quite a lot of haze around the peak, and rather than remove it, I actually added to it using the dehaze tool and a radial filter to actually add haze and brightness. Now, this is a process that I use a lot in my image editing to shape the light. If you've seen my Lightroom video or my Capture One video, I explain how I use radial filters to selectively brighten parts of the image using the dehaze tool, because I find that this enhances the way that the light's falling, and this again serves as a way to move the eye through the image, bringing attention to parts of the image that we want to focus on. So, okay, that's it for this video. I'll be putting together part 2 of this trip in a few weeks or so and uploading that. And then over the next month, I'm going to be off to Lofoten and then off to Iceland, and I'll be shooting more videos in the snow there. So I hope this has been interesting and I hope it's been useful. Thanks for watching and good luck with your own photography. See you soon, and as always, take care.